The word I'm going to talk about is samovar, and it's spelt in English Samovar. It's a Russian word. It's quite a strange word in the sense that we think it's very exotic, but in fact it's a very ordinary, bog standard word in Russian. It means, well, sam means self, and var or varit means to cook or to boil, sometimes to brew. So it's something, a utensil which brews things for you. So a self-boiler, I suppose, would be an absolute direct translation. This is a samovar, but it's a very modern, well, it's a mid-20th century samovar from the Soviet period. And it's in fact an electric samovar, which is a bit of a come down because the original samovars are much more complicated. The original samovar would have been this shape. It's a rather classical shape, like an urn. And sometimes they were a bit fatter or a bit taller or a bit rounder, but generally they had this classical shape. And the whole of the vessel really holds water. But in the older ones, there was a pipe going up the middle in which you put some kind of fuel, like charcoal, coal. If you were perhaps poorer or lived in the country, you'd use pine cones. So you'd have a pipe up the middle, water around the outside, and you'd have a little chimney on the top. And you'd be able to get in at the bottom, and you'd have these hot coals, or you'd light the pine cones, and they would then heat the water in the vessel. It would be brought to the table, and you would have also prepared in a much smaller pot, like this one. This is again a modern Soviet one. A very, very strong brew of black tea, much, much stronger than you could imagine English tea being. And you would remove the chimney. I'm going to remove the top in this case from this modern one. And the pot would stand on the top like that to keep what was called a zavarka, a kind of boil up, that means, to keep the brew of tea as hot as possible inside. And of course the coals would still be in it at the table, so it would still be hot. I can show you a picture of a very elaborate samovar, which I think probably makes the whole system much clearer. And you've got a lovely decorated pot on the top and a beautiful golden samovar. So we've got our samovar on the table with the brew on the top, and you would use, these are the typical utensils that would have been used at the time. China obviously was highly prized. This is a piece of actually early 19th century China. These are perhaps what we associate much more with Russian tea drinking. They're called podstakanchiki, which means glasses in holders, really. But in fact, they were adopted from Germany sometime late in the 19th century, but I thought you'd like to see them. Now, what we do is we take the zavarka, our brew up, our very strong brew up, and we put a little tiny bit in the cup or the glass. In fact, it's often said that the men had the glasses and the lady the china, but I'm not sure that should be that kind of gender distinction myself. We'll put that back on there, and then what we do is you add the water, which is kept really boiling hot all this time, and you add it to the tea. Now you can see the risks of spilling and drippage are really quite strong. And then I would pass you or your lady friend that cup of tea, and then add some hot water perhaps for another of the guests. By presiding over the samovar in the way that I am, I'm actually showing that I'm a very powerful person in this household, and this is the kind of activity that the lady of the house would probably have indulged in. If you were a Russian, you'd probably have sugar in your tea, and you'd place your sugar lump, I haven't got one I'm afraid today, you'd place your sugar lump on your spoon and you would drink the tea through the sugar lump. It was also very common practice to have your cup of dark tea and then add a beautiful spoonful or a spoonful of beautiful homemade jam. Now this is a very elaborate preparation, so the tea moment in the day of the household became quite an important one. It was when the household gathered together, and it was a time for talking. If you go to any production of a Russian play in English on the British stage, you can almost guarantee two things. One is that there'll be birch trees on stage, because that's another iconic symbol of Russia, and that they'll bring a samovar in at some point, because I think to British eyes and to British minds, the samovar somehow sums up Russia. I think there's an affinity here because we're both tea-drinking nations. I think it's a misapprehension because it very much stands for Russia, but I don't think they understand the whole, or we don't understand, I should say, the whole culture that surrounds the samovar itself.